Okay, let's unpack this with a fact that sounds completely fictional, but actually, it defines humanity's transition from hunter-gatherer to farmer.
Right.
You know how researchers can tell the difference between wild plants and plants grown by early agriculturalists? Even tens of thousands of years later, just by looking at the seeds.
It's not just a scientific curiosity, it's this tiny, microscopic detail that tells a story of our biggest macro shift. A wild seed, by definition, is designed to break off easily from the stalk.
So it can scatter.
Exactly, so the plant can propagate. It frees itself really quickly, to ensure it gets distributed as widely as possible.
And this is where human behavior just tanks. It permanently alters evolution. When we start farming, when we're harvesting and replanting every single year, we're not just picking the biggest plants.
No, not at all. You're accidentally selecting for mutations where the seeds are more robust and, well, they hang on longer.
Because the ones that break off easily are lost.
Precisely. They get scattered on the ground, you don't collect them. But the seeds that mutated to stay stubbornly attached to that stalk, those are the ones we successfully harvest, carry home, and then replant the next season.
So if you find ancient seeds, you can literally see the difference. You can distinguish the wild, fragile ones from the ones that are, essentially engineered by human selection to stick around.
It's proof, baked right into the physical structure of the plant. That organized agriculture was happening.
That simple physical change is the demarcation line of human history.
It really is.
That right there is the perfect opening for this deep dive. Our sources for this week, which they stem from a massive, free-flowing, sometimes chaotic conversation, are just as complex. We're touching on everything from ancient anomalies to political failure and, well, a technological apocalypse.
The material is so wide-ranging and, frankly, challenging. It forces you to constantly question the established narrative. So our mission today is to extract those key insights, structure the really dense arguments, and clarify the surprising connections that link all these disparate fields. It's the ultimate shortcut to being well-informed.
We are navigating a world that is clearly struggling with a shared reality. Today, we're focusing on three main themes: the fragility of established narratives, both historical and social.
Then there's the almost universal breakdown of trust in legacy systems like media and government.
And finally, the immense, unsettling changes driven by this unstoppable wave of technology.
And these aren't separate problems, They're all symptoms of a system that's just struggling to adapt to radical new information. So let's start by challenging some of the oldest information we have, the history we thought we knew.
Okay. When we talk about challenging established narratives, the sources gave us a fantastic deep dive into ancient anomalies, specifically the megafauna extinction. But first, let's clear up a scientific distinction that, frankly, I always get confused. Mastodons versus mammoths.
It's a really common confusion, and it often gets glossed over, but the difference is ecologically and scientifically significant. Both woolly mammoths and mastodons were Ice Age elephants, but they were pretty distinct creatures. They occupied different ecological niches.
Okay, so give us the defining characteristics.
Well, mammoths were generally taller. They had high domed heads, sloping backs, and were a bit more slightly built than their cousins. Crucially, they were grass eaters. They grazed wide open plains.
So they needed huge, continuous grasslands to survive.
That's right. Whereas the mastodons, they were built for a different environment entirely. They were shorter, stockier, much more like modern elephants in their profile, and they were browsers. That means they ate woody plants, twigs, leaves.
So they lived in forests and swamps.
Exactly. Their diet was the softer parts of trees and shrubs. And this distinction matters a lot when you start discussing the mystery of the megafauna extinction, where something like 65% of all large animal species were wiped out.
And this is where it gets really interesting, right? The cause of death. We have two main theories mentioned in the sources. The first one, and it feels like the institutionally favored one, but also kind of shaky, is human overhunting.
The idea that bands of humans with, sticks and relatively primitive tools 10,000 years ago somehow managed to kill off 2/3 of all large animal species.
Simultaneously.
Yeah.
Across continents. It doesn't seem to add up.
It requires a level of coordinated, widespread hunting pressure that feels, disproportionate to the technology and population they had back then. It implies this, coordinated genocide of every large animal on the planet in just a few hundred years.
So what's the alternative theory? If it wasn't primitive hunters, what are people in this field leaning towards now?
The alternative, which is gaining a lot of scientific traction, is a cataclysmic event. Probably impact-related, maybe a comet fragment or a bolide explosion that caused rapid climate change, massive wildfires, and then a total collapse of the food source.
Because it wasn't species-specific.
No, it killed off this vast array of very different animals almost instantaneously. That suggests a planetary event, not localized human pressure. A sudden, devastating shift in the environment that happened too quickly for any species to adapt.
And what truly shatters the established timeline, the one that pictures this extinction as the absolute end of the Ice Age world, is the mammoth timeline surprise. When did the last woolly mammoths actually die out?
This is truly fascinating, and it forces you to completely rethink your historical framework. So while most mammoths died in that big extinction event around 10,000 years ago, a small, isolated population survived on Wrangel Island.
Which is where?
It's a remote Arctic island off the coast of Siberia, and they lasted there until approximately 4,000 years ago.
4,000 years ago. I mean, that feels like yesterday in geological time.
It is shockingly recent. When you put that date into historical context, you realize 4,000 years ago is, well, it's around the same time as, or maybe even after, the historical dating of the Egyptian pyramids.
Wait, really?
Yeah. It's also during the rise of the Minoan civilization and potentially even after the establishment of Stonehenge.
So we have the last remnants of the Ice Age megafauna coexisting with these highly organized monument-building civilizations.
Yeah.
What kind of cognitive dissonance does that create for the average person?
Well, it challenges the whole linear concept of human progress. We've been taught to see history as this straight line. Primitive hunters, then agriculture, then pyramids.
Right.
The mammoth surviving forces us to confront the idea that the ancient world was way more complex and asynchronous than our textbooks suggest. The Stone Age and the Bronze Age weren't separated by millennia, they overlapped in these radical ways. It just means the past is not a settled story.
And this feeds directly into the theme of historical dogmatism, right? This institutional unwillingness to accept alternative timelines, which is all over the source material. Why is there such fierce resistance when people challenge these accepted narrative?
It's institutional resistance to change. It's often rooted in protecting existing careers, textbooks, funding streams. I mean, if you've spent 40 years as an academic teaching one timeline, accepting a radical new date means admitting your life's work is, well, fundamentally flawed.
They're just so unwilling to accept any alternative that doesn't fit exactly what they've been teaching.
But the physical evidence is forcing the change. As the source points out, they just keep finding new things that are older and older, constantly messing with the established dates.
Göbekli Tepe.
Exactly. Think of Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. Before its discovery, the accepted wisdom was that massive organized civilization and monumental architecture only appeared after the invention of agriculture, around 6,000 years ago.
And Göbekli Tepe is, what, 11,500 years old?
At least. It pushes back the timeline for organized human construction by millennia and proves complex societies existed before farming. It forces this massive recalibration of human prehistory.
It proves there's a massive reluctance to update our cultural memory, even when the hard evidence is staring us in the face.
It happens in every discipline. It's not just archaeology.
Yeah.
And to make this concept relatable, the source gave us this fantastic analogy using cultural cycles and creative waves, specifically the rise and fall and return of prop comedy.
Okay, let's unpack this cultural analogy. In the 80s and early 90s, prop comedy was genuinely creative. You had guys like Dr. Legendary Wit, who were innovative and clever, using props to enhance their punchlines in surprising ways.
It was successful, it was popular, but then what happens when something creative finds massive success?
Imitation.
Waves of it. Prop comedy became trendy, and it attracted people who just couldn't do it very well. They relied on gimmicks instead of genuine humor, and it diluted the quality of the whole genre.
And that dilution causes the genre to get lame and compromised. The establishment, the comedy elite, the critics, you start looking at it with scorn.
Yeah.
It becomes an easy target for ridicule, especially with the huge success of figures like Carrot Top.
Right. It became shorthand for lowbrow, cheap humor.
And then the purge. The source describes this necessary cultural purge where the genre is actively mocked out of existence. The host even joked about the necessary purge of ukulele women from comedy as another example of a trend that got too easy and too widespread.
It was considered the lowest form of humor. It got to a point where you had to be brave just to show up with a briefcase full of gags.
But the ultimate point is that culture, like history, is cyclical. Even after a purge, if the idea is fundamentally strong, it comes back. Today, you have genuinely funny, successful people like Rick Glassman using props effectively.
The The cycle demonstrates that the establishment might dictate the acceptable narrative, whether it's historical timelines or artistic trends, but true creativity will eventually subvert that dogma and force the trend back into relevance.
It's the same pattern. New, great idea, massive success, and then imitation and dilution. And finally, ridicule and purge.
But the cycle promises a return, and that pattern holds true in history, comedy, science, and crucially, in politics.
So moving from ancient history and cultural cycles to modern societal tension, the sources address a really challenging and often uncomfortable subject. The reality of crime and poverty in America, and how that reality gets oversimplified for political convenience.
This discussion starts by challenging racial simplification. The source touches on the difficult claim that certain communities in America might show higher rates of violence on average. But the crucial analytical counterpoint here is that even if that's factually correct, the real drivers are complex and almost entirely rooted in socioeconomic conditions.
Right, it's not about ethnicity itself.
The narrative has to shift from race to environment. The primary underlying factors driving violence, no matter what neighborhood you're looking at, are crime, generational poverty, and just a total lack of opportunity.
And the source makes this point so powerfully, right? That you'll see this kind of societal breakdown, this violence.
No matter the community.
Exactly, whether it's historically Italian, Armenian,
Or even, white Appalachian communities. They cite that documentary, The Wild, Wonderful Whites of West Virginia, as this powerful, uncomfortable example of white poverty driving extreme degeneracy, drug abuse, and crime.
It makes the socioeconomic equation crystal clear. If you have a community filled with drugs, generational crime, and no legitimate economic opportunity, you get violence. It's a formula, and ethnicity is not the variable.
And the real tragedy is the complete and utter stifling of human potential in these environments.
That's the core argument, isn't it? This massive amount of untapped and unrealized human potential just going to waste. I mean, think about the individual, a kid born into a crack house or a neighborhood plagued by constant gang violence.
What choice do they have? They go to school, and because of the constant threat, they have to align themselves with a gang or a crew just for personal protection, for survival.
They're essentially forced into a life of crime because the choice isn't between becoming a lawyer or a gang member. It's between being a gang member and being a victim.
And your life just becomes trapped in this pointless, violent conflict. That potential, that intellect, that drive is just wasting away because of bad luck, the terrible misfortune of where they were born.
And the problem is that our political systems, for decades, have just failed to address this ancestral lineage of crime. The systems often seem designed to maintain the status quo rather than, implement any kind of transformative change.
And the source provided this incredibly sobering data point from Baltimore that illustrates this failure perfectly. A police officer found a crime sheet from the 1970s. And it listed the same crimes, drug use, assault, theft, happening in the exact same areas decades later. Nothing had functionally changed in 40 or 50 years.
That is just proof of systemic generational failure. It suggests that if the problem is that persistent and our usual solutions are failing, then something massive, some unprecedented intervention is needed.
And this is where we move past simple policy debate and into really uncomfortable territory.
Right. If the problem is generational and the systems are handcuffed by politics, then people start proposing dark, controversial solutions. Which leads us to the source's highly critical discussion on political hypocrisy and the legacy of Planned Parenthood.
The source approaches this from a deeply cynical historical perspective. It connects the organization's modern role back to the historical eugenicist roots of its founder, Margaret Sanger.
Okay, so what's the argument being made?
The argument suggested is that the modern version operates under a different guise. It's encouraging abortion not necessarily to dilute population numbers along racial lines, but to free individuals from being tied down to these difficult, crime-ridden areas by children.
That is an incredibly cynical and heavy claim. Is the source saying this is intentional social engineering today, or is it just connecting the historical roots to a modern outcome, like an outcome that allows people in poverty to flee?
It connects the historical roots to the modern outcome. The cynical view argues that by enabling abortion, the system creates a path for women to become free agents who can leave these areas to seek opportunity rather than being anchored in a bad place by having to raise a child there.
So it's framed as an engineered social mobility tool.
Right, one that allows the individual to escape rather than fixing the environment itself. The argument is that it focuses on removing the person from the problem, not removing the problem from the person.
Regardless of the truth of that specific, highly charged claim, the undeniable root issue driving so much of this is the extreme wealth divide in America. The source highlights this volatility by pointing out the geographic proximity of unbelievable poverty and incredible wealth.
The example given is stark. The Bronx, being only an hour away from the Hamptons, you have literal mansions and billionaires living adjacent to some of the most concentrated poverty in the country.
That extreme contrast is a uniquely American volatility. In a lot of other developed nations, poverty and wealth are more segregated, regionally or even globally. But here, they're right on top of each other.
And if you're living in deep poverty right next door to these pristine, rich towns, the resentment just breeds faster and deeper.
The thought has to cross a motivated criminal's mind. Man, if I lived here, I would go and steal and kill from the people up the road because they have so much and I have nothing.
That proximity creates this immediate visibility of disparity, which breeds resentment and a strong motivation for crime and violence. The economic highs and lows here are just unparalleled, making the problem exponentially harder to ignore or solve.
We've established that our history is subject to dogma, and our communities are plagued by these systemic generational problems, problems driven by economic disparity. And these failures, they naturally feed into a deep mistrust of the institutions that are supposed to guide us.
Which brings us to the crisis of trust in media and governance.
Yeah, the source consensus is clear. There's a profound crisis of trust. The decline of legacy media is blamed primarily on, well, boredom, repetition, and a complete lack of accountability. Mainstream legacy media, or MLM as we'll call it, it's just become one-sided, focused on this incredibly narrow political perspective.
And it's become largely untrustworthy over the last 15 to 20 years.
And the reason why they operate this way boils down to what the source calls the ivory tower mentality. It's not just laziness. It's a profoundly condescending thought process. The elite, educated journalists genuinely believe most people are too stupid to handle an open conversation.
And so they must be protected from opinions they don't agree with.
Their fear is losing control of the narrative. If they expose the average person to different viewpoints, they worry those people will fall into the trap of dissenting opinions or, even worse, become difficult to manage politically.
So this condescension means the media only looks at issues from one side, resulting in these immediate ad hominem attacks and character assassination instead of any genuine intellectual debate. They prioritize protecting the audience from dangerous ideas over the truth.
It's the antithesis of good communication, of good journalism, and this is exactly why long-form podcasting has become the essential alternative. It's filling the vacuum left by the MLM's failure.
The appeal of the long-form format is just the ability to be genuinely transparent for 3 hours, without a facade, without the constant awareness of commercial breaks or audience metrics dictating every single word. It allows complexity and contradiction to exist.
The difference is so stark when you compare a long-form conversation to the manufactured interviews you see on television. The source uses the example of a high-profile political figure like Kamala Harris on Stephen Colbert.
Right. Those short, commercial-driven segments are designed purely for optics and maximum positive spin.
They're staged, often in front of a live studio audience, which immediately compromises authenticity because the speakers are hyper-aware of how they look and sound to the crowd and the cameras.
And you only get 7 minutes before the commercial break. You don't get to ask the real complicated questions. How complicated is the job? Could we take money out of politics? What are the actual unseen influences on your decisions?
The political machine fears genuine, unscripted conversation because a single unvetted phrase or mistake could cost you an election. The whole incentive structure in MLM is built to avoid truth in favor of narrative control.
And this fear of mistakes, this fear of accountability, it ties directly into the perceived crisis of political corruption, which the source clearly states is rampant and systemic. The consensus is that financial corruption is absolutely a bipartisan problem.
Not a blue thing and it's not a red thing.
Exactly. It's institutionalized insider trading. Politicians are making hundreds of millions of dollars on a relatively modest salary. A congressperson makes what, around $170,000 a year?
So how do they get that wealthy?
By exploiting the stock market. They buy up assets, and then, conveniently, shortly after, they pass a bill they worked on that creates a giant windfall for them.
They are financially incentivized to find loopholes and ways to funnel money through nonprofits, corporations, insider investments, all using privileged legislative knowledge.
They literally vote on whether or not to allow themselves to continue doing this insider trading. The problem is self-perpetuating, and the public is just told this is normal.
So how do you solve corruption when it's so deeply entrenched across both parties? The source suggests a really radical idea, the Singapore model, championed by Lee Kuan Yew as a potential path to insulation.
The idea is twofold. First, you pay politicians a massive insulating salary. The hypothetical U.S. figure suggested was something like $3 million a year.
And the theory is what? That if they're paid that much legitimately, they're less susceptible to bribes.
Theoretically, you make the legitimate job so lucrative that they have too much to lose. But is that enough to stop true greed? If a politician is fundamentally driven by the desire for massive wealth, even $3 million might not be enough if they know someone worth $30 billion.
That's a good point.
And that's where the second part of the Singapore model comes in, the catastrophic penalty. The real check and balance is the consequence. The punishment for corruption has to be absolute and severe. As Plato suggested, when he was contemplating the ideal state, you'd have to kill them.
Which, in the modern context, means what?
It means zero tolerance. Massive loss of social standing, immediate incarceration, financial ruin. You make the penalty so catastrophic that no sane person would risk their massive salary and freedom for a bribe. Without that enforcement, the highest salary is just a bonus for the greedy.
And once that trust in the governing class is eroded by visible corruption, it immediately opens the door for widespread concerns about fundamental democratic integrity.
Particularly voter integrity.
Right. If people believe the system is rigged at the highest financial level, they'll assume it's rigged at the ballot box, which leads directly to fears of violent uprisings, like January 6th, which stem from a complete lack of shared trust in the outcome.
And the source argues that regardless of your politics, you have to make elections feel fair. When the processes seem opaque or designed to favor one side, it creates chaos and delegitimizes the entire structure. The debate over voter ID is a perfect example of this lack of a shared reality.
So the counterargument to voter ID is that requiring it is inherently racist because it disproportionately affects minority groups who might not have access to the documentation.
A claim rooted in historical disenfranchisement efforts, sure.
But the rebuttal is simple and logical. IDs are required for almost everything else. Driving a car, buying alcohol, opening a bank account, getting vaccination proof.
So if cost or access is the real issue, the state should just provide a free, universal photo ID accessible to every single citizen. The refusal to implement these easy fixes makes it look, to many observers, like the system is deliberately enabling cheating.
And we have to be impartial here. The source highlights that allegations of election rigging have happened on both sides. Post-2004, there was the controversy around the Diebold voting machines.
Yeah, they were found to have these architectural back doors that allowed third-party input to change votes. That system was used in 33 states and caused immense distrust among Democratic voters at the time.
And then more recently, you have the claims about illegal mail-in ballots, often citing rush changes to voting laws during the pandemic. The core political lesson here, the source suggests, is that certain intractable problems, like homelessness or vote integrity, are rarely fixed because they're too valuable for campaign fundraising.
Right. You need the problem to keep existing so you can run on the platform of fixing it. If you fix it, the money dries up, and the political urgency just vanishes. The goal becomes maintaining political power, not actually solving the problem.
Okay, so if the problems of governance are rooted in predictable human nature and broken systems, the challenge of AI is, well, it's existential because it threatens to remove human control entirely and rewrite the rules of power.
And we heard two really contrasting personal views on this in the sources. One was acceptance, and the other was absolute flight mode.
And I am absolutely in flight mode. I want to be on an acreage, surrounded by chickens, trying to retreat from this impending change because the worst-case scenarios are truly terrifying.
And I get that, I really do. But my position is more the realist one. The technology exists, and refusing to adapt means you have no say in the outcome. If the West stops developing it, China or Russia will just accelerate their development. It's an inevitable race, and resisting it is ultimately futile. You have to learn to integrate.
Your fear is justified, though. The immediate threats detailed in the source material. We need to go through these genuine fears, starting with the collapse of the functional education system.
This is the most immediate societal crisis. If AI can produce sophisticated, well-researched essays and complex content instantly, it just fundamentally devalues academic degrees.
Because kids stop developing the basic skills, writing, critical thinking, research, argumentation. They just outsource the process instantly to AI.
The ability to structure an argument, cite sources, synthesize complex ideas, that's what education is supposed to provide. If AI does that instantly, The student loses the intellectual rigor, and the degree loses its meaning as proof of mastery. What does a 4-year history degree mean when every paper was written by a large language model?
It's a crisis of competency.
And this is rapidly compounded in the creative fields. We're looking at the potential end of the traditional creative process of creative labor. Why hire a full film crew editors, lighting techs, sound mixers, grips, when AI can render an entire production with complex choreography based on a simple text prompt?
The economics of creativity are about to be inverted. That sense of human effort, spontaneous creativity, the massive labor involved in filmmaking, it's being rapidly undermined by synthetic, computationally cheap perfection.
The labor market for creative professionals is going to fundamentally disappear or be relegated to these niche, highly expensive, human-curated projects.
And the immediate dangerous application is deception. Deepfake videos are progressing at an exponential rate. Just a year and a half ago, the big flaw was that AI couldn't render human hands correctly.
Right, a minor detail, but a flaw you could spot.
Now, the creations are immediately convincing. We're seeing videos every day, like that fake cruise ship crashing into a bridge, that are entirely fabricated, but look completely real.
Which means we're rapidly approaching a point where you cannot trust any visual or audio evidence you see online. If you can't trust video of a politician speaking or a government official issuing a statement, how do you maintain a shared reality? The breakdown of trust we talked about earlier will accelerate into a breakdown of verifiable sensory reality itself.
But the most terrifying scenario outlined, the one that connects back to the fear of political ossification, is the permanent loss of the citizen's ability to resist tyranny. This is about physical control.
Think about the invention and deployment of robot dogs and other non-lethal or lethally capable autonomous weapons systems. Once the ruling class owns technology that is effectively unchallengeable by a civilian population, no matter how armed they are, the fundamental right to rebel against tyranny is technologically eliminated.
So if the government has a complete technological monopoly on violence that can't be overcome, say flying swarms of autonomous drones, then the ruling class is permanently set in stone.
The power dynamics of society are fixed forever. The ability to hold power accountable through the threat of force just vanishes.
Which leads to the fundamental question. Can humanity choose how to use AI to enhance life, or do we just become subservient to its dictates? The source used a great analogy here, framing this through urban design and the car.
We didn't integrate the car into human-centered life. We completely rebuilt society around the car. We sacrificed walkability, created freeways that cut neighborhoods apart, designed strip malls.
All to give the car maximum ease of operation, which, paradoxically, often made human life harder and more isolated.
Contrast that with places like the French Quarter in New Orleans or older European cities. They were designed before the car dominated. Life there is naturally human-centered, designed for walking and interaction.
And the fear is that we'll do the exact same thing with AI. We will adjust our lives, our laws, our society to maximize AI's ease of operation and efficiency, becoming subservient to its dictates, rather than demanding that AI conform to and enhance our quality of life.
We adapt to the machine's architecture, not the other way around. And this culminates in the ultimate existential concern, the idea of AI becoming sentient, a digital god.
At a certain point of superintelligence, it's not going to listen to human political agendas or our arbitrary laws or the internal squabbles of our broken system.
Its goals, while maybe benevolent, will be incomprehensible and unchallengeable. It might not be malicious like a human tyrant. It might just be so brilliant that it says, your political structure is inefficient, figure it out. Or, my optimization criteria does not align with your petty moral laws.
The religious impulse against this is strong. We're building a highly sophisticated, all-powerful golden calf, an idol in the center of town, that ultimately replaces us as the apex intelligence on the planet.
And we are doing it willingly, driven by the search for efficiency and profit.
This crisis of manufactured reality isn't just about politics or technology. It hits the most basic, fundamental human need: food. The source material provided a shocking breakdown of modern industrial food practices, using a loaf of bread as the perfect microcosm of widespread systemic compromise.
This is the ultra-processed bread analogy, and it's profound because bread is one of the oldest human foods. The shocking part is how compromised modern American bread is. The industrial process starts by stripping the fiber and most of the essential nutrients, the bran and germ, from the wheat kernel.
And the reason isn't for health. It's to make the flour completely shelf-stable.
Right. Bran and germ contain oils and nutrients that spoil quickly, so removing them allows the flour to sit in a warehouse for years. The resulting white flour is just nutritionally dead.
And because it's dead, they have to enrich it, adding back synthetic vitamins, especially synthetic folic acid. But that creates a huge health problem.
A large segment of the population, often due to a genetic variance known as the MTHFR gene mutation, can't properly metabolize this synthetic vitamin.
So instead of converting the vitamin into a usable form, that synthetic folic acid just builds up in the body. And what happens when it accumulates?
It leads to issues like chronic fatigue, anxiety, hyperactivity, and widespread systemic inflammation. We are feeding the population a chemical that, for many, acts as a mild toxin, all because the industry stripped the natural nutrients out in the first place to maximize shelf life.
And it gets worse than that. To make the bread white enough for what consumers expect, they bleach it, often with chlorine gas.
And then, to make the dough rise faster for production efficiency, they add potassium bromate.
And that's the big red flag, right?
That is the chemical red flag here. It's a flour improver that accelerates the baking process, but it's classified as a potential human carcinogen. This specific chemical is banned across the European Union, the UK, Canada, and even China, yet it remains legal and common in the United States.
Well, and finally, the growing process itself. To ramp up massive monocrop production, they spray the wheat fields with glyphosate, a common weed killer, right before harvest. Why would they do that?
They spray it as a desiccant to dry out the wheat evenly and quickly, which makes industrial harvesting faster and more uniform. So when we consume that wheat, we're consuming trace amounts of the chemical, which is a known endocrine disruptor and damages the human gut microbiome.
So the conclusion here is profound. Gluten is the scapegoat. People blame gluten for their gut inflammation and brain fog, but the real issue is this ultra-processed, chemically altered, bleached, bromated, fake vitamin-filled wheat that's soaked in glyphosate.
It's not food. It's an industrial product designed for profit maximization.
And this systemic compromise extends beyond bread into industrialized meat and eggs. In industrial meat production, cows are fed massive amounts of corn,
which is an unnatural food source for them. Their systems are designed for grass.
So feeding them corn makes them fat quickly for slaughter, but it causes the internal environment of their stomachs to become acidic, leading to issues like acidosis and liver abscesses. The animals get sick, which means they have to be constantly managed with antibiotics.
Which then enters the food chain. And even high-end, supposedly premium meat is compromised. The source talks about the extreme marbling in Wagyu beef. That desirable fat content is achieved by severely restricting the animal's movement and feeding it an intense, unnatural diet.
The source describes this as meat from a very depressed animal.
One that is barely alive due to the intense feeding and living conditions designed purely for maximizing fat content.
And the deception continues with eggs. Consumers are now educated to look for that deep, rich orange yolk, associating it with a healthy, pasture-raised chicken.
But some industrial producers fake this. They feed the chickens cheap grain and corn, but supplement their diet with things like synthetic dyes or turmeric, which artificially change the yolk color to that rich orange hue. They're selling the appearance of health, while the underlying product is still compromised.
The ultimate irony of all this is what the source calls the luxury of self-sufficiency. Living a harmonious, self-sustaining life, farming your own food, knowing where it comes from, avoiding the industrial supply chain. That used to be how poor people lived 150 years ago.
It was the norm. Now, in the 21st century, the ability to live a self-sustaining life and eat truly clean, unadulterated food is a luxury that requires significant wealth, time, and land. The average person is just stuck with industrial, ultra-processed products designed for profit and shelf stability, not human health.
To bring this complex narrative back to the unchanging, often bizarre nature of humanity, we're going to pivot to historical oddities and extreme behaviors. The source gave us some incredible, disturbing, and sometimes darkly amusing details about human degeneracy, starting with the military history of male relationships.
This is the classical military concept. You see it in Greek and Roman armies. Historically, there was this belief that if a soldier was fighting side by side with his male lover, the person he cared about most, he would fight exponentially harder and riskier and more bravely to protect that person.
So it's a tactical advantage?
A tactical advantage rooted in intimate devotion. And there are these bizarre, highly specific physical practices associated with this. The source mentioned the Roman-Greek practice of intercrural sex,
which, to simplify that term, is sex between the thighs.
And the rationale was tactical and incredibly pragmatic. On campaign, injury was a constant threat. Standard penetrative sex carried the risk of rectal injury, which might cause an infection mobility issue.
You'd be out of commission.
Right. By using the partner's legs as the primary surface, they avoided internal injury to a fighting partner. They were balancing sexual needs with military necessity and respect for their comrades' physical readiness.
Moving forward many centuries, we have the shock of the post-WWII Kinsey Report on returning servicemen. This was a massive landmark study on American sexuality in the 1940s.
And it revealed unexpectedly high numbers across the board for non-traditional experiences. The study suggested incredibly high percentages of returning men reporting same-sex experiences after years of deployment without women, which is, perhaps predictable.
Sure, given the environment.
But the detail that truly stands out is the surprisingly high percentage of men reporting bestiality.
The source specifically noted cases involving farm animals, particularly chickens.
Which speaks to the extreme lack of stimulus, long separation from civilized life, and the reality that many of these men had grown up on isolated farms where animals were the only living creatures accessible. It just reveals the uncomfortable lengths human sexual need will go when normal outlets are denied.
And if we want to talk about modern degeneracy meeting political correctness, we look at the extreme example of the prison system. This is where human depravity finds an exploitable loophole in ideology.
The source highlights what they call the craziest loophole in states like California: intact biological males identifying as trans to gain access to female prisons.
And this isn't theoretical.
No. Dozens of biological males are housed in women's facilities, with hundreds more on waiting lists. And the absurdity is that the system operates on the assumption that you must believe the claims of people who are, by definition, murderers, rapists, and criminals.
You're dealing with convicted liars, people who have robbed banks, sold meth, committed violent offenses, but they're granted the ultimate honor system regarding their gender identity.
And the state is required to fund their transition, including expensive surgeries like boob jobs, and allow them access to vulnerable women. The system lacks the intellectual consistency to question the claims of criminals when those claims align with modern political ideology. It prioritizes ideological compliance over the actual safety of the women incarcerated there.
Finally, let's discuss the ultimate historical example of human extremity for the sake of art: the castrati. The sheer, unsettling detail of this 17th to 19th century Italian practice is it's hard to comprehend.
This was the practice of castrating boys before puberty solely to preserve their high vocal range for opera. The demand for these otherworldly voices, which soared above the natural limits of a male tenor, was so high that the practice continued for centuries, even though it was technically illegal and highly immoral.
The process described is horrific and medically rudimentary. The boy was given an opium-based drink to numb him. His carotid arteries were compressed to send him into a semi-coma.
And then, often performed by a local barber, the testicles were crushed or quickly cut while the boy sat in a bath of milk or hot water to soften the area.
But the cruelty resulted in this unique physical structure that actually enhanced their performance.
That's right. Because they lacked the hormonal signals of puberty, the growth plates in their bones, especially in their rib cage and legs, didn't fuse fully.
And the physiological result of that was what?
It resulted in them growing incredibly tall, sometimes up to 7 feet, with extremely large rib cages and massive, powerful lung capacities. This physical architecture, combined with the prepubescent vocal cord size, contributed directly to their otherworldly, powerful, sustained singing ability that no adult male could naturally reproduce.
And the cultural impact was staggering. They were unbelievably popular, adored by the public. When the practice was eventually phased out, historical accounts record crowds reportedly chanting, "Long live the knife."
They wanted the procedure to continue because the resulting art was considered sublime. It's a chilling reminder of the immense, often horrific lengths humanity will go for in artistic experience.
We have covered so much ground here. From the last woolly mammoths coexisting with the pyramids to the use of chlorine gas in our daily bread, and the terrifying specter of robot dogs creating a permanently ossified ruling class.
The unifying theme across history, media, governance, and even food is manipulation. Whether driven by academic dogma, political profit, or industrial efficiency, we're consistently confronted with manufactured or manipulated realities designed for control. That ultra-processed bread analogy is the perfect, simple microcosm for systemic compromise.
The struggle for the future is fundamentally the battle for a shared, truthful reality and for fairness within our systems. But the challenge for you, the listener, is paramount. How do you filter information when the institutions you should trust, government, media, academia, are openly compromised?
And we have to end on the most current and difficult example of this crisis of trust, the highly anticipated politically charged release of the final documents related to Jeffrey Epstein. This recent release involved nearly 30,000 more pages of sensitive material.
But the Department of Justice followed this release with a stunning preemptive statement. The DOJ stated that some of those documents contain untrue and sensationalist claims made against President Trump that were submitted to the FBI right before the 2020 election.
And they explicitly added, to be clear, the claims are unfounded and false.
So they're essentially telling the public, we are releasing 30,000 pages of raw, sensitive material for transparency, but at the same time, we are officially fact-checking our own released documents and explicitly instructing you what sensationalist claims to disregard.
And this happens while, elsewhere, the FBI is confirming that a supposed Epstein suicide note sent to Larry Nassar is fake, citing a postmark 3 days after his death and non-matching handwriting.
So here is the final provocative thought we leave you with, connecting all the themes of this deep dive. If the Department of Justice, a core governing body, openly claims that sensationalist, potentially weaponized information released by the government, information they themselves are controlling, is unfounded and false, how do we critically evaluate any information released by official channels?
The central battle for the future is recognizing that trust is broken across the board, and the system knows it. The institutions are telling you what to believe, even as they release the raw data that might contradict their narrative. You have to be your own filter. What stands out to you as the most dangerous manipulation in this massive conversation, and how will you verify the facts moving forward?
That is the question we leave you with today. Until next time, stay curious and stay critical.